I guess in discussing livability, I mean, I think it's interesting to talk about it maybe in relation to your topic, because much of the focus has been on some notion of the role of public space and the role of commons in its contribution to a kind of livable city. And we can sort of track the history of that notion of livability in a Copenhagen context, in a kind of longer term sense, where we link it back to sort of more radical shifts in the strategy of urban development that were explored in the late 1980s and 1990s, that became Copenhagen's kind of development model, which we know now as the sort of Copenhagen model. And then we can look at the kind of shift in development and kind of gearing up of that livability discourse around 2008, post 2008, which is sort of coinciding with, of course, the kind of global financial crisis and a greater interest in discussions of subjective well-being as a key theme in how we evaluate the success of societies, but also the success of cities. So we see a kind of growth of livability discourse at the same time as a growth of livability metrics around that time. So a lot of these different competitive rankings kind of emerge around this period. So we see the emergence of Monocle's livability index. So in many ways we can kind of connect that to a project of the kind of competitive city, and a lot of that is to do with competition for tourists, for attracting global investment capital, attracting a global educated workforce, but also a kind of competition between cities, which revolves in the way it's presented largely around public space, in terms of a public space agenda. So I think we could talk a lot about what kinds of how do you say, kind of spatial elements or products are kind of attached to this livability agenda. Maybe it could be interesting to talk about perhaps how in many cases they don't speak to the logic of commoning, but they speak to the logic of experience economy, to the logic of the idea of competitive city, logics that play out in things like attractive and branded public spaces, cultural infrastructure, shopping precincts, innovation districts, these kind of things.
Do you see that there's kind of, it strikes me that this livability agenda started as something that was a way of analysing existing space, looking at certain cities and the way they were functioning and kind of rating them. But it seems that it's almost become self-fulfilling now, in that it's an ambition for future development of the city, which then takes on quite a different role. And somewhere like Copenhagen, it feels like now that's become the kind of one of the driving forces of kind of future development. And I guess you're maybe critical of that, because it then begs the question about which criteria are being used to define this term livability, which when you're just rating a city is maybe fine, but when you're also defining the city through those metrics, then does that become problematic?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. It does become problematic. And of course, it comes from a kind of well-intentioned kind of context. And of course, that's about kind of connection to a larger discourse, excuse me, around, of course, the idea to sort of, how to say, kind of humanize the failures of a kind of public space and collective space that resulted from the modernist functionalist city. So there is a kind of ambition in linking the sort of larger discourse around what represents success from economic metrics to more subjective well-being that sort of gets concretized around the sort of late 2000s. And we see that take many different forms. And on the other hand, of course, we see it as part of a longer tradition, which has to do with this discussion about humanizing urban space, let's say kind of in the traditions of Jane Jacobs or Jan Gehl, which is a discussion, let's say, about how can we talk much more about a sort of experiential, psychological, phenomenological relation of the urban subject in the city. And that's, of course, sort of one of the driving discussions around introducing livability as a kind of ambition, as a goal that's maybe moving from a number of other kinds of ambitions that were either explicit or implicit in the kind of previous regimes of urban development. And I guess that sort of notion of urban livability, as you suggested, has become, during particularly the early and middle 2010s, as something which became a kind of regime of sort of strongly sort of politically supported, consensus-based term, or representing a kind of consensus for the way that the city would try to focus on the conditions of everyday life of its citizens. And I think that is sort of, it has many positive aspects and positive developments behind it. But the challenge, I think, is also, as you suggested, when that becomes something that is explicitly kind of quantified through these different rankings, we can start to ask a number of questions about what lies behind the rankings, also what lies behind the kind of feedback mechanisms between the rankings and the logics of the rankings and the decision making that takes place at the local level. And I think that, one could see that depending on which different sort of index you look at, there are different sort of emphasis points in those different indexes. So we could see, for example, that Monocle was heavily focused on a certain sort of image and sort of imaginary of an urban subject. And that sort of imaginary and the corresponding sort of metrics for it, we can say are not inclusive. They are not, let's say, addressing a kind of diverse populace which has sort of equal right to the city, we could say. So if those sort of metrics are used to drive urban development, urban branding, urban planning, the argument, we could say, at many levels is problematic. One of them is that it's a very sort of exclusionary vision of who is being addressed, and what kind of ideal for the city does it represent.